Before we step deeper into this nightmare, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments if you'd survive a job like this. It was late September of 2015, the kind of afternoon where the sun struggled against storm clouds, leaving the school in a gray, uneasy light. I was a new teacher, barely 2 months into my job at a small-town elementary school. The building itself felt older than it should have, with peeling paint, creaking floors, and hallways that seemed to hold on to every echo. I told myself the unease was just nerves, but deep down I knew something didn't belong. The classroom I was given sat at the far end of the East Wing, away from the busier halls. My students were 8 and 9 years old, energetic, sometimes loud, but nothing unusual. I had a neat row of desks, sunlight from tall windows, and the smell of chalk that lingered no matter how much I cleaned. Yet one desk always seemed out of place, sitting by the window as though waiting for someone. I thought little of it at first. On the 4th day I noticed him, a boy, dark hair falling across his forehead, sitting quietly at that empty desk. He had no backpack, no coat, just a small stack of worn books in front of him. He didn't raise his hand, didn't speak, and yet I swear I could feel his eyes on me. When I took attendance, his name wasn't on the list. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was a mistake I would clear up later. At recess, I asked one of the other teachers about him. She gave me a puzzled look, then laughed like I was joking. "You've only got 22 kids," she said. "That's your roster." But when the children returned, I counted 23. He sat silently, turning the pages of a book no one else seemed to notice. My pen trembled as I made a small note in the margin of the attendance sheet. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, trying to make sense of it. Maybe he was new and his paperwork hadn't gone through. Maybe he was visiting, a relative of another student, but the way the other kids ignored him didn't feel natural. It felt like they couldn't even see him. I didn't write it down in my lesson journal. I didn't want to look crazy. The following morning, I arrived early, determined to check the desk. The books were still there, battered readers, a notebook with no name, pencils worn down to the wood. I picked up the notebook and flipped through it. Every page was filled with drawings of the classroom, from strange angles, like sketches made from the corners of the ceiling. The final page showed me, standing at the chalkboard, with the boy's desk drawn in complete shadow. By noon, I couldn't ignore it. He was present again, watching, silent, and I forced myself to address him. "What's your name?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. His lips moved, but no sound came out. The children around him carried on with their lessons as if nothing was happening. I felt the blood drain from my face. When the bell rang, the students ran out into the hall, laughter bouncing off the walls. But he didn't leave. He sat perfectly still, eyes locked on me, while the room emptied. "It's time to go," I whispered. But he only smiled faintly before fading. Not walking, not standing, but dissolving like mist. I dropped my chalk in shock. I searched the hallways, checked the bathrooms, even asked the janitor if he had seen a boy leave. "No stragglers," the janitor said, shaking his head. "All clear." He gave me a curious look when I insisted there had been someone still in my room. I didn't push it further. I already felt like I was losing my grip. That evening, I called the school office. I asked again about new transfers, late arrivals, any mix-ups in my roster. The secretary clicked through her computer records. "Nope, you've got 22 students. That's it." "Why, are you missing one?" Her casual tone chilled me, because I wasn't missing one. I had one too many. Sleep that night was nearly impossible. I replayed the image of his pale face, his silent lips, the way he watched me as though expecting something. My dreams, when I finally drifted off, were filled with chalk dust and whispers I couldn't understand. I woke in the dark, heart pounding, certain that I wasn't alone in my house. The next day, the desk was waiting. I tried to move it before class, dragging it to the back wall, away from the others. But when I turned around, it was back by the window, books neatly stacked as though untouched. My hands shook as I erased the chalkboard, trying to pretend everything was normal. By the end of that week, I could no longer tell if I was imagining it. Each day, the boy appeared. Each day, no one else acknowledged him. And each night, I lay awake listening for footsteps in the hallway of my empty home. Something about his presence felt less like a child, and more like a warning. I considered quitting, but the thought of leaving felt strangely impossible. It was as if the school itself was keeping me there, holding me in place the same way it held that desk. I told myself I'd stay just one more week, one more chance to prove to myself that I wasn't unraveling. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Whatever that child was, he wasn't supposed to exist. And if I kept teaching in that classroom, he wouldn't let me forget it. The real terror, though, was that part of me didn't want him to leave. The second week began with rain hammering against the windows, drowning the schoolyard in a curtain of water. My students shuffled in with wet coats and dripping shoes, chattering about the storm. As I turned to the board, I saw him already there, seated at the window desk, perfectly dry. His books were untouched by the rain, his face pale in the dim light. My chest tightened with dread. I tried to focus on the lesson, my voice trembling as I explained fractions, but my eyes kept darting to him. Each time I looked, he seemed a little clearer, sharper, more solid than the day before. The other students raised their hands, argued over answers, laughed quietly at their mistakes, and still, not one of them looked his way. It was as if he existed in a shadow world only I could touch. At recess, the rain hadn't stopped, and most of the kids stayed inside, playing board games or drawing on the chalkboard. He remained at his desk, staring at the storm outside. I thought I saw his lips move again, whispering to the glass, but the sound of rain swallowed every word. When I stepped closer, he turned his head toward me, and for a second I swear I saw water dripping from his hair. That night, I reviewed the attendance sheets again. 22 names. No variations. No late transfers. I pulled out the notebook I'd found on his desk and flipped through it once more. The sketches had grown darker, heavier pencil strokes. The classroom scribbled in shadows. One page showed rain pouring through the ceiling, flooding the room. In the corner, he was drawn smiling. The next morning, I made a decision. I would not acknowledge him, not even look at him. If he wanted attention, he would get none from me. But ignoring him proved harder than I thought. The sound of his chair creaking, the scrape of his pencil, the flutter of pages in his book, they echoed louder than anything else in the room. Every movement reminded me he was still there. By the third day of rain, I couldn't take it anymore. When the students lined up for lunch, I walked straight to his desk, slamming my hand down on his notebook. "What do you want?" I whispered through clenched teeth. His dark eyes met mine, and his lips parted. This time, I heard a single word barely audible over the storm. "Remember." My knees buckled, and I nearly stumbled back. Remember what? The word gnawed at me all afternoon. When the final bell rang and the children left, I stayed behind, staring at his desk. He was gone again, books neatly stacked. I wanted to throw them out, to burn them, but something in me resisted, like a hand pulling me back from the fire. That evening, I found myself driving through the rain, past the edge of town, toward the abandoned houses near the old riverbed. I didn't know why I went there, only that the word remember echoed in my head, leading me like a compass. The houses stood in silence, windows broken, doors sagging. I didn't get out of the car. I just sat there, soaked in unease. When I returned home, my front porch light flickered. Inside, the house was colder than it should have been. I walked through each room, whispering to myself that I was alone. Yet on the kitchen table, I found his notebook again, though I'd left it locked in my classroom desk. The page had changed, a new drawing of my own house, with a single dark figure standing in the upstairs window. The next day, I brought the notebook to school with trembling hands. I asked the secretary if anyone had been in my classroom after hours. She frowned and shook her head. "Nobody goes into your room but you," she said firmly. I didn't tell her about the notebook appearing in my house. I didn't want to see the look on her face. Back in class, I set the notebook on my own desk, determined to keep it in sight. But as I turned to write on the chalkboard, the sound of flipping pages made me whirl around. It was gone. My eyes darted across the room, and there it was, back on his desk by the window. He sat motionless, staring at me, the faintest grin curling on his lips. My breath caught in my throat. I rushed over and snatched it away, but when I opened it, the pages were blank. Not a single drawing, not a single word. My skin crawled with the realization that he wanted me to see only what he chose. The power wasn't in the notebook, it was in him. That night, thunder shook the house, rattling the windows. I tried to distract myself with grading papers, But every time I looked up, I thought I saw movement in the reflection of the glass. Once, I swore I saw a child's silhouette in the window, but when I rushed to pull back the curtains, the yard was empty, drenched in rain. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I couldn't deny it anymore. The boy was not just confined to the classroom. He was bleeding into my life, into my home, into my mind. The word remember clawed at me in the quiet hours. Remember what? A past student? A tragedy? Something buried in this town that I had no part in but somehow couldn't escape. On Friday, as the storm finally broke and the sun cracked through the clouds, I thought maybe the nightmare had ended. The classroom filled with golden light, my students cheerful and loud. But when I turned to the window desk, he was there. Only this time, for the first time, he was smiling broadly, as though he knew I had finally given up resisting. And that was the moment I realized the truth I had been avoiding all along. The boy wasn't just an illusion. He was waiting for me to acknowledge something far worse, something that had already begun long before I ever stepped into that classroom. The weekend passed in a haze of half-sleep and gnawing paranoia. I found myself pacing from room to room, checking every shadow twice, unable to relax even in daylight. On Sunday night, when I finally sat down to prepare Monday's lesson, I realized I'd written the same word across the top of every worksheet. Remember. My hands trembled when I saw it, because I had no memory of writing it at all. When Monday came, the classroom was unusually quiet. The children filed in, taking their seats with the normal chatter of a new week, but the energy felt muted. I scanned the desks quickly. 22 children, laughing, whispering, arranging books. And then, like a slow chill, my eyes fell on him. The boy was there as always, but this time his desk was no longer by the window. It had moved itself into the front row. My heart nearly stopped. He sat just a few feet away from me now, his dark hair hanging over his eyes, his small hands folded neatly on the desk. He looked more solid than ever, his presence undeniable. I swallowed hard, forced my voice steady, and began the lesson, but I could feel his gaze drilling into me. Every number I wrote on the chalkboard seemed to blur under his stare. By mid-morning, I realized something even stranger. The children's voices seemed muffled, like I was hearing them through a thick wall, but his silence was sharp, clear, louder in its absence than any laughter. When I called on one of the girls to answer a math problem, she looked right through him, as if the front row desk was empty. The world felt tilted, off balance, like I was the only one living in two overlapping realities. At lunch, I stayed in the classroom, pretending to grade papers. He didn't move, didn't eat, didn't even blink. I watched the rain-dappled window behind him, trying to steady my breath. Finally, I whispered, "Why are you here?" His lips moved slowly, forming shapes I could almost read. When I leaned closer, the words slid into my mind like ice water. "You forgot me." The force of the words sent me stumbling back. I dropped my pen, my papers scattering across the floor. He didn't follow, didn't stand, only sat calmly, watching me with an expression that felt older than a child's. That was when I realized he wasn't just haunting me, he was accusing me. That night, I tried to dig through the school archives. I asked the secretary if I could see old attendance records for research, and she reluctantly let me into the dusty storage room. Boxes of files stacked high, the smell of mildew and paper filling the air. I searched class rosters from the past decade, desperate for a name or a photo that matched him. But the records only deepened the mystery. One year, 2010, the file for my classroom was missing entirely. The discovery gnawed at me. Why would 1 year be gone? I pressed the secretary again, but she only shrugged. "Probably misfiled or lost," she said, not looking at me. But the tightness in her voice betrayed something more. She knew something she wasn't saying. And as I walked back through the halls, I felt his presence with every step, like invisible eyes boring into the back of my skull. The following morning, I resolved to test something. As the children worked on silent reading, I set a small toy car on his desk, one of the classroom rewards I often gave out. I walked away without speaking. A few minutes later, when I glanced back, the car was gone. My stomach twisted. I searched the floor, the desk, my own pockets. Nothing. When I looked again, it was back on my desk, spinning slowly as if someone had just touched it. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time in years. Still, I couldn't escape him. At 2 a.m., I woke to the creak of a chair. My eyes adjusted to the moonlight spilling through the window, and I froze. A school desk sat in the corner of my bedroom, books stacked neatly on top. I knew I hadn't brought it there. My body refused to move, every nerve screaming. When I blinked, the desk was gone, but the smell of chalk and damp paper lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. I pressed my hand to my chest, my heart beat frantic, whispering over and over that I was dreaming. Yet when I reached for the light, I found a piece of paper on my nightstand, a drawing of my bedroom with the desk in the corner, and me asleep in bed. The next day, my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the chalk. The students noticed, whispering among themselves. I tried to smile, to assure them I was fine, but the boy's stare never left me. He was there every second, his dark eyes swallowing me whole. I wondered how long it would take before the other children started to notice my unraveling. By Friday, I knew I couldn't keep this secret much longer. Something had to give. The boy's voice was in my head now, whispering during lessons, humming when I tried to sleep. He wasn't fading. He was growing stronger, more rooted in every part of my life. I was no longer sure if I was his teacher or his prisoner. I hadn't spoken to my family in weeks, too ashamed to tell them what was happening. But that Friday night, after another sleepless stretch, I finally broke. I called my sister Sarah and begged her to come over. My voice cracked with every word, trembling between confession and madness. She heard the desperation and arrived within the hour, her face pale with worry. We sat at my kitchen table, the clock ticking loudly on the wall. I tried to explain the boy, the desk, the notebook that moved on its own. Sarah listened with a careful silence, nodding but frowning, as if she was unsure whether to comfort me or call someone for help. "You need rest," she whispered finally. But when I showed her the drawing of my bedroom, her face drained of color. She turned the page over with shaking fingers, staring at the lines that mirrored my room too perfectly. "This isn't a kid's doodle," she muttered. "This looks like someone was standing there watching you." The words hit me like a stone. For the first time I saw fear in her eyes, not pity, fear, and that terrified me even more. Sarah insisted on staying the night, refusing to leave me alone. We set up blankets on the couch, the TV flickering quietly in the background as rain tapped against the windows. For a while, I almost felt safe with her there. But around midnight the air shifted, heavy damp carrying the faint smell of chalk and wet paper. Sarah sat up suddenly, clutching my arm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. At first I didn't. Then faintly the creak of a chair echoed from upstairs. My stomach dropped. Together we crept up the staircase, every step groaning under our weight. The hallway stretched before us, darker than usual, as though the shadows themselves had thickened. At the end of the hall, my bedroom door stood slightly open. Inside, the moonlight fell across the floor, and there it was. The desk, his desk, placed neatly in the corner as if it belonged there all along. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The books on top of it were wet, dripping onto the floorboards, forming a small puddle that shimmered like ink. I felt my knees weaken, barely able to breathe. Sarah backed away, whispering, "This isn't possible." But the sound of pages turning froze us in place. The notebook lay open on the desk, flipping slowly as though guided by invisible fingers. Each page revealed more drawings of me, standing, sleeping, writing on the chalkboard. And on the final page, Sarah's face appeared, sketched in harsh black strokes, her eyes wide in terror. She slammed the book shut, her hands trembling. "We're leaving," she said firmly, dragging me toward the door. But before we could step out, the air grew icy. My breath fogged in front of me, and a low hum filled the room, vibrating through the floor. From the corner, the boy's voice whispered a single phrase, layered and distorted. "You forgot both of us." Sarah bolted, pulling me with her down the stairs. We stumbled into the living room, gasping for breath, clutching each other like children. Neither of us dared to speak for several minutes, the silence pressing against us like a weight. Finally, she whispered, "What does that mean? Both of us? Who's the other one?" I had no answer, only a growing dread that I didn't want to know. The rest of the night stretched into eternity. We left every light on, every door unlocked, as if escape might save us. But nothing happened. The house remained quiet, deceptively normal. while our fear lingered like poison. At dawn, Sarah left reluctantly, promising to call a friend who might understand. Her voice shook, but her determination gave me a flicker of hope. That Monday, I dragged myself back to school, hollow-eyed and shaking. The children noticed immediately, their whispers buzzing through the classroom like bees. But what terrified me most was him. He was waiting again, this time not just staring at me, but smiling faintly at Sarah's name when I whispered it under my breath. He had heard her. He knew her now. I nearly ran from the room, my hands gripping the chalk until it snapped in two. I was no longer just a teacher caught in a nightmare. This thing, this child, had bled into my family, binding himself to me in ways I couldn't control. And the more I resisted, the stronger he seemed to grow. By the end of that week, I couldn't deny the truth anymore. My life wasn't mine alone. One night later that week, Sarah called me in tears. She swore she'd seen him. She described his dark hair, the way he watched her from the edge of her bed as she pretended to sleep. My blood froze as she whispered, "He followed me home." I wanted to deny it, to tell her she was imagining things, but I knew the truth. The boy had spread. That night, I sat awake in the kitchen, staring at the notebook. The words, "You forgot both of us," circled in my head like a curse. There was no longer just a haunting. There was a history buried beneath all of this. A wound I hadn't touched yet, and if I didn't uncover it soon, I knew it would consume not only me, but everyone I loved. And as I closed my eyes in exhaustion, one truth burned clearer than ever. Whatever that boy was, he wasn't alone. There was someone else, another presence waiting, watching, tied to me in a way I didn't yet understand. And the moment I learned who it was, everything would change. The following week, I barely recognized myself in the mirror. My skin looked pale. My eyes ringed with sleepless shadows. Each morning I forced myself into the classroom, telling myself I was strong enough to face him again. But deep down I knew something had shifted. He wasn't just haunting me anymore. He was waiting for me to understand something I'd tried all my life to forget. On Tuesday, while the children were practicing spelling, I opened the notebook again. For days the pages had been blank, mocking me with their silence. But now, new sketches sprawled across the paper in heavy pencil strokes. This time, they weren't of the classroom or my bedroom. They were of a playground, rusted swings swaying, a cracked slide standing crooked in the dirt. I recognized it instantly. The abandoned playground on the far edge of town. A chill ran down my spine. That playground had been shut down years ago, after a tragedy the town never fully spoke about. A boy had gone missing there, and the case had gone unsolved. My parents used to hush me whenever I asked about it, steering the conversation away with tight smiles. I slammed the notebook shut, but the image burned in my mind. Was that what he wanted me to remember? That night, I drove to the playground, headlights cutting through the misty air. The place was silent, lifeless, surrounded by a sagging chain-link fence. I parked outside and stepped through a gap in the metal, my heart hammering in my throat. The swing chains rattled softly in the breeze. Though the air was still, I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing on me. In the center of the playground, beneath the old slide, I saw it. A desk. His desk. The same books stacked neatly on top, pages wet from the dew. My legs nearly gave out. I stumbled closer, breath hitching, and placed my hand on the wood. It was cold, damp, but solid. Not a hallucination, not a trick of the mind. He had dragged me here to see something. When I opened the top book, my breath stopped. It wasn't a textbook this time, but a diary. The pages were smeared with water damage, but I could still read the shaky handwriting. They spoke of loneliness, of a boy who sat alone in class every day, ignored by everyone, forgotten even by his teacher. The final entry ended mid-sentence. She didn't see me leave. She won't remember. Tears blurred my vision as I staggered back. Was this about me? Had I once been his teacher? Years ago, before I even remembered? No, it couldn't be. I was too young, but then why did the words feel carved into my bones, as though I'd been carrying them my whole life? My knees buckled and I fell into the damp dirt, clutching the diary like it might swallow me whole. When I looked up, he was there, the boy, standing in the shadows near the swings. For the first time, he wasn't seated at the desk. He was upright, watching me with eyes that glistened like broken glass. My throat went dry. "Who are you?" I choked out. He didn't move, didn't blink. Then slowly he raised his hand and pointed, not at me, but past me. I turned. In the darkness, another shape stood at the far edge of the playground. Smaller, slighter, a second figure barely visible in the fog. My heart clenched as the words seared through my head again. "You forgot both of us." My body froze. There were two of them, and until that moment I had only seen one. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the desk. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, as the two figures seemed to watch me together. They weren't threatening. Not yet. But their silence was heavier than any scream. I wanted to run, but something inside me whispered that leaving now would only make them follow me closer. I was already bound to them. Finally, I tore my gaze away and sprinted to the car, slamming the door shut with shaking hands. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the fog. For a split second, both figures reflected in the beam, two pale shapes, standing perfectly still in the playground. And then, as I blinked, they were gone. Only the rusted swings remained. I drove home on autopilot, hands numb against the steering wheel. The diary sat on the passenger seat, dripping water onto the upholstery, as if it bled memories I couldn't contain. Every turn of the road echoed with one thought: what if I really had forgotten them? What if my whole life was a lie patched together around a truth too horrible to carry? Back in my house, I placed the diary on the kitchen table and just stared at it, unable to open it again. The silence around me was thick, broken only by the sound of the clock ticking. Midnight came and went, and still I sat there paralyzed, listening for creaks, for whispers, for the sound of a chair moving in the dark. And then I heard it. Not one, but two. Two chairs scraping slowly across the floor upstairs, dragging in unison, deliberate and heavy. My breath caught in my throat, my body refusing to move. The boy wasn't alone anymore. He never had been. And now, whatever bound them to me was only beginning to surface. I didn't sleep that night. The sound of those chairs dragged across the ceiling until dawn, stopping only when the first rays of sunlight touched the curtains. By morning, I was trembling, weak, but determined. If I didn't try to understand this, I would lose my mind completely. There had to be an explanation. Supernatural or not, I needed answers, and I needed them fast. The first place I turned was the library. Buried in the local history section, I found brittle newspapers from 2 decades ago. The headlines screamed of a tragedy the town had tried to bury. 2 children vanished from school. No trace found. My stomach lurched. The dates matched the abandoned playground's closure, and the names, though faded by time, twisted in my chest like a knife. One of the missing children had my last name. My own blood. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the chair. Could it be a coincidence, or had I somehow suppressed this my whole life? The thought left me dizzy, clutching the edge of the table as the whispers from the paper seemed to curl into my ears, reminding me of voices I had sworn never to hear again. Desperate, I contacted a retired detective whose name appeared in one of the articles. He answered in a raspy voice, reluctant at first until I told him who I was. Silence filled the line for several seconds before he agreed to meet me. We sat in a dim cafe, his hands shaking as he stirred his coffee. His eyes darted around as if afraid someone else might be listening. He confessed the case had haunted him for years. 2 siblings, a boy and a girl, had gone missing after school hours. No bodies were ever found, no suspects arrested, but the strangest detail was never printed in the papers. Several teachers swore they had no memory of the children ever being enrolled. It was like the town forgot them overnight, he said, voice breaking. Even their own family stopped talking about them. I felt a deep cold settle inside me. The detective leaned closer, his whisper rough and urgent. Some people said the children weren't real, that they belonged to the building, to the school itself. But I saw the records. I saw the desks with their names carved into them. They were there, and then they weren't. His hands trembled as he slid me an old photograph. In the photo, the boy's face was clear, eerily familiar, the same boy I'd seen at the desk. The girl, however, was harder to make out. Her features were blurred, her eyes smudged into darkness, as if the camera had refused to capture her properly. My chest tightened. I could almost feel her standing behind me, just beyond the edge of the frame, watching me hold proof of her existence. The detective pushed the photo toward me and muttered, "If you see them, you mustn't acknowledge the girl. Do you hear me? The boy seeks recognition, but the girl wants something else." His warning carved itself into my bones. My mind raced, torn between disbelief and terror. Why had the girl remained hidden until now? And why was she becoming clearer the more I remembered? Shaken, I left the cafe, clutching the photograph like a lifeline. That night, I brought it home and placed it beside the diary. I tried to resist opening the notebook again, but curiosity gnawed at me until I couldn't hold back. The diary's ink had bled further, but new lines etched themselves before my eyes, fresh strokes forming across the page as if an invisible hand was writing in real time. The words told me to return to the classroom. Not the playground, the classroom. My pulse quickened. I had locked the room days ago, avoiding it like a plague. But the message was clear. My return was inevitable. My hand shook as I traced the words, heart pounding at what I might find waiting for me there. The next morning, I went early, long before the other teachers arrived. Unlocking the door felt like peeling back a wound. The air inside was thick, damp, carrying a smell of chalk and mildew. The desks looked ordinary at first glance, except for his. It sat perfectly in place, clean, polished, and waiting. On the seat rested a folded piece of paper. My fingers trembled as I opened it. A crude sketch stared back at me. It showed the classroom, the blackboard, the rows of desks, and there, sitting at the teacher's desk, was not me, but the girl. Her face still obscured, but her posture rigid, commanding as though she had been in charge all along. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about memory. This was about power. I tore the paper in half and shoved it into my pocket, fighting the rising panic. At that moment, I heard a giggle, faint, high-pitched, echoing across the room. My skin crawled. It wasn't the boy's laugh. It was lighter, sharper, almost mocking. I spun around, but the room was empty. Still, the sound clung to the air, curling into every corner like smoke. For the first time, I realized the detective had been right. The boy had been a warning, but the girl, she was the true danger. And now, she was no longer content to linger in the background. She wanted me to know she was there, and she was ready to step fully into the light. That night, I left every light in the house on, but the brightness didn't bring comfort. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls, bending and twitching as though alive. I sat at the kitchen table with the diary open before me, my eyes burning from exhaustion. For hours, the pages remained still, until suddenly, without warning, the ink began to spread again. This time, it didn't form words. It formed a drawing. The picture was my house, every room carefully sketched, every hallway perfectly rendered. But in the upstairs bedroom, my bedroom, two small figures stood beside the bed. My throat tightened as I glanced at the ceiling above me, hearing the faintest creak of footsteps pacing back and forth. They weren't just haunting me at school anymore. They had followed me home. I slammed the diary shut, but that didn't silence the sound. The creaks grew heavier, closer, until the floorboards above groaned like they might snap. I backed toward the door, desperate to escape. Just as I reached for the knob, the air around me turned frigid. From the corner of my eye, I saw something impossible. The reflection in the window showed not my kitchen, but my classroom. And behind me, the girl sat at my desk, smiling. I staggered outside into the night air, heart hammering, sweat chilling on my skin. The street was deserted, silent, but every house seemed to lean closer, their dark windows like watching eyes. I clutched the diary to my chest and stumbled down the road, not knowing where I was going, only knowing I couldn't stay. The air smelled of damp earth and iron, heavy and suffocating. Finally, I reached the edge of town, the old cemetery. My legs gave out, and I collapsed near the crumbling gates. That's when I noticed something that stopped my breath. Two small gravestones, side by side, half buried in weeds. Their inscriptions were worn, but the faint outline of names scraped across the stone matched the ones from the newspaper. The children hadn't just disappeared. They had been buried all along. I reached out to touch the stone, and the moment my fingers brushed the cold surface, the ground trembled. A low rumble vibrated through the earth, spreading under my knees, my ribs, my skull. Dirt shifted near the gravestones, as if something below wanted to claw its way free. My pulse roared in my ears. The boy wanted me to remember, but the girl, she wanted me to dig. I stumbled backward, shaking my head. No, I couldn't. I wouldn't. But then I heard it again. The giggle. Not faint this time, but right behind me, close enough that I felt the air move. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. But the graveyard was empty. Only the weeds swayed in the cold wind. The sound lingered, echoing long after it should have faded. When I looked back down at the gravestones, something new had appeared. A small scrap of paper wedged between them. My shaking hands pulled it free. On it was a single word, scrawled in jagged handwriting. Remember. My chest ached as the memory clawed its way up. A flash of me as a child, sitting in that same classroom, staring at two empty desks no one else seemed to see. The truth was unraveling. This wasn't just their haunting. This was my past bleeding back through the cracks I had buried it in. And yet one question tore at me. If the boy had been begging me to remember, what had the girl been demanding all this time? What did she gain from pulling me deeper into the nightmare? I pressed the paper to my chest, gasping, shivering, broken. My whole body screamed for me to run. But my mind whispered otherwise. Running wasn't possible anymore. They weren't confined to one place, one classroom, one memory. They were everywhere I went, and the girl especially was growing stronger. She wanted me to face something I wasn't ready to see. By the time I returned home, dawn was breaking. The house felt hollow, walls groaning with an invisible weight. I crept upstairs to my bedroom, too drained to think, and collapsed onto the mattress. But sleep never came. Instead, I heard the scraping sound again, this time directly under my bed. I froze. Slowly, the sound grew louder, closer, until I felt the frame lift slightly beneath me. I rolled onto the floor, heart racing, and dropped to my knees. There, pressed against the wooden slats beneath the bed, was a sheet of paper I had never placed there. I pulled it free with trembling fingers. Another sketch stared back at me. This time, not of the classroom, not of the playground, not of my house. It was a picture of me, standing at a grave, with the girl's hand resting on my shoulder. My stomach churned as I crumpled the paper and tossed it across the room. It didn't matter. The message was clear. The girl wasn't waiting for me to remember. She was waiting for me to accept her, to bring her back, to dig her out of the ground she had been trapped in all these years. That realization struck harder than anything else. The boy wanted me to acknowledge the truth, but the girl, she wanted resurrection. And as the shadows lengthened across the walls, as the whisper of her laughter curled around my ears, I knew she wouldn't stop until I obeyed. I couldn't deny it anymore. The boy's silent watchfulness and the girl's mocking laughter had carved their place into my life. My every breath felt borrowed, every shadow alive with their presence. By the time the next night fell, I was done running. My trembling hands packed a flashlight, a shovel, and the diary. I knew where I had to go. The graveyard. The streets were empty, hushed, as though the town itself knew what I was about to do. When I reached the cemetery gates, the fog was already waiting for me, rolling thick across the earth. The gravestones loomed like crooked teeth, jutting from the ground at unnatural angles. And in the distance, I could see them, the two small stones side by side, illuminated faintly in the mist. My legs shook as I stepped closer. The boy was already there, seated cross-legged atop his grave, his face half hidden by the mist. His eyes locked on me, unblinking, filled with sorrow rather than malice. The girl stood beside him, sharper in outline now, more solid than ever before. Her smile glowed faintly, like a knife catching moonlight. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. I dropped the shovel onto the dirt with a dull thud. "This is what you want?" My voice cracked in the night air. The girl tilted her head, her hair falling in strands that blended with the fog. For the first time, she moved, nodding slowly, her outline rippling like smoke. The boy shook his head violently, fists clenching, eyes burning with a desperate plea. They were at war with each other, and I was the battlefield. Tears blurred my vision as I drove the shovel into the ground. The soil was damp, heavy, resisting me as if it too wanted to keep its secrets buried. Each strike of the shovel sent vibrations through my bones, every scoop of earth releasing a smell of rot and iron. I kept digging, faster, harder, until my breath came in ragged gasps and sweat slicked my skin despite the cold. The deeper I dug, the louder the sounds became. A child sobbing, a girl's laughter, my own name whispered in voices that weren't mine. The boy crouched at the edge of the grave, shaking his head violently, tears streaking his pale face. The girl leaned closer, her silhouette hovering above the pit, waiting for me to break through. And then, my shovel struck something solid. I froze, heart slamming against my ribs. Slowly, I brushed away the dirt. Wooden planks emerged beneath my trembling fingers. A box, small, child-sized. My stomach turned to stone as my hand lingered on the surface. It wasn't a coffin. It was a desk. The same desk he had always sat at, buried beneath the earth, waiting to be found. I collapsed onto my knees, trembling uncontrollably. The girl's laughter rose higher, piercing the night air, echoing off the gravestones like broken glass. The boy lunged forward, his hand reaching out toward me, his mouth opening in a soundless scream. My hands itched to tear the desk free, to drag it into the open, but I couldn't. My mind screamed against it. And then I saw it, carved into the side of the desk, deep gouges that could only have been made in desperation. My name, over and over again, scratched into the wood. My throat closed, breath catching as the truth slammed into me. I hadn't just been haunted by these children. I had been part of their story from the very beginning. The girl stepped closer, her form sharpening into something horribly human. I could almost see her eyes now, black voids that swallowed all light. She reached her hand toward me, slow, patient, inevitable. My body froze as her fingers nearly touched mine. The boy screamed soundlessly again, and this time I understood. If I took her hand, there would be no going back. My lungs burned as I stumbled back, scrambling to my feet. I threw the shovel into the pit and ran, not daring to look back. The fog thickened, swallowing my path, every gravestone identical, every shadow reaching for me. But I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing against the cemetery gates, heaving, broken. Behind me I heard nothing, no laughter, no sobbing, just silence. When I staggered home hours later, dawn was breaking. The house greeted me with an emptiness that felt like reprieve. I collapsed onto the couch, closing my eyes, praying it was over. But when I opened them again, the diary lay open on the coffee table. A new page had been filled, the ink wet, the letters sharp. One line repeated across the entire page. You almost remembered. The final words blurred as tears stung my eyes. I hadn't ended it. I hadn't escaped. I had only postponed what they wanted. And deep down, I knew the girl would come again. She would not stop until I dug deep enough to uncover the truth she demanded I face. For days, I couldn't return to the school. Every time I thought of stepping back into that classroom, my chest tightened until I couldn't breathe. I taught from home instead, sending lessons online, hiding behind the glow of a screen. But even distance couldn't shield me. At night, the sound of chalk scratching across a blackboard echoed faintly through my walls. And in the mornings, I found words written on my mirrors. You almost remembered. I tried to burn the diary. I poured lighter fluid across its fragile pages and set the match. The flames caught quickly, rising high, but within seconds they died on their own, leaving the book untouched. Not a single page charred. It sat there on the table, smoke curling from its edges, as though mocking me. I understood then that I could never destroy it. It wasn't just paper and ink. It was the bond itself. And so I carried it back to the school one final time. The halls were empty, silent, the air thick with dust. As I entered the classroom, my heart stopped. Every desk had been moved, circling the center of the room. And in the middle stood that same wooden desk I had unearthed in the cemetery. How it had arrived here, I'll never know. But waiting beside it were the two children. The boy sat as always, shoulders hunched, eyes wide with sorrow. The girl stood tall beside him, her outline sharp now, her face nearly clear. Her smile was gone. In its place was something colder, hungrier. I felt my legs weaken as I stepped closer. For the first time, I spoke their names aloud. The names etched into those gravestones. The air shifted, heavy with recognition. The boy's lips trembled, as though he'd waited years for someone to say his name again. Tears welled in his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, he looked less like a phantom and more like a child. The girl, however, tilted her head slowly. Her expression never softened. If anything, her gaze grew sharper, cutting deeper, as though my acknowledgement had given her more power than ever before. I dropped the diary on the desk, my voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The boy lifted a trembling hand, pointing to the book. The girl raised hers too, pointing not at the diary, but at me. My heart stuttered. The boy wanted me to read. The girl wanted me to surrender. Two choices, both unbearable. With shaking hands, I opened the diary. The final page filled itself with ink. As I stared, words appeared line by line, forming a sentence that turned my blood cold. "One of them belongs with you." My throat tightened. Did it mean I had to choose? My pulse pounded in my ears as the children's gazes bore into me. The boy pleading, the girl demanding. I slammed the diary shut and staggered back. "No." My voice cracked through the silence, but the desk scraped closer, circling tighter around me. The boy's eyes filled with desperate sorrow, while the girl's black stare pierced through me like a blade. The air grew colder, my breath visible, the walls of the classroom groaning as though the building itself leaned closer to hear my decision. I fled before I could answer, tearing the door open and running down the halls until my lungs burned. But even as I escaped the school, the words from the diary repeated endlessly in my head. "One of them belongs with you." The truth was inescapable. Whether I chose or not, one of those children had already bound themselves to me. Now I hear their presence wherever I go. Sometimes the boy's quiet weeping fills the corners of my room. Other nights, the girl's laughter scratches against the walls until I cover my ears. They are no longer confined to graves, to classrooms, or even memories. They are inside my life, waiting for the moment I break. And maybe that's why I'm telling you this. Because if they ever stop haunting me, if one day they disappear entirely, it won't mean they're gone. It will mean they've moved on, to someone else, maybe to a teacher like me, or maybe to you.